Resume. Okay, we can see it is clicking along. That's good. All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to week 12. We are getting down to the wire, actually. So we've got this week, next week's Thanksgiving. Remember, no office hours next week. The following week is, we're going to do power analysis the following week. And then that's week 13. And then week 14 is the review week. And then week 15 is the final. Well, I mean, I guess it's not week 15, it's the final. So yeah, we're sort of down to the end. So because of that, as I was preparing for this week, which we're going to talk about residuals a bit, but we didn't get a chance to talk about the error covariance structure last week. So I want to definitely talk about that a little bit as well. So we'll start with that. And then as I was sort of thinking about it, there were a couple of other little odds and ends that I wanted to make sure that we at least sort of talked a slight bit about. So this week is kind of a potpourri. I don't think we'll actually get through all of the slides. In fact, there's no way we're going to get through everything that I've prepared about residual analysis, but we will get through some of the stuff and you will have it for your own use. So there's one little piece of good news in all of this, though. No homework this week. I decided to take pity on you. No, actually, maybe I decided to take pity on them. I don't know, me. I'm not sure who. But I started to think about it and I was like, Thanksgiving break, we should not have homework, especially if they're not office hours next week. And also, when I went to go make the homework for the residual analysis, I realized just how cumbersome it would be for you to actually do some of this stuff in R. Like, I'm giving you a markdown file. So you could theoretically replicate it. But like, I'll just sort of compare and contrast for you. So like, when you use HLM, I miss HLM. Oh, HLM, why are you so expensive? Anyway, when you use HLM to run multi-level models, you can just say, I want the residual files, and will spit out a residual file at level 1 for you with all the level 1 residuals you could possibly want. And it'll spit out a level 2 residual file for you with all the level 2 residuals you could possibly want. And you can say, I want a CSV file, I want it in Stata, I want it in SPSS, I want it in SAS. You choose how you want it to come out, and then you just analyze it in the package that you're comfortable with. And it's just 2 nice files. In R, it's like way more flexible, so there definitely are advantages to that, but you're basically, creating each residual separately, right, which is fine. Then you've got to pull all that together into a data file to do your residual analyses. And I just started thinking about you all doing that over Thanksgiving, and I started to feel really bad for you. So you see, I'm not a total Scrooge. And I was just like, I just feel like this is more so than some of the other things we've done, a place where R could really get in the way of actually accomplishing what you want to do. So I've decided no homework this week, which takes the pressure off a little bit, which means that I will talk about the most interesting parts of residual analysis. Some of it's just like, oh, make histograms, make scatter plots. I don't feel like I need to say a lot about that. So you'll have the slides and you'll have the R markdown for some of that. But there are some things I want to show you about how you can get empirical Bayes residuals in R. I definitely want you to know how to do that. It's useful for your own, work. And I think there are some interesting points that I want to make about residuals. So on that note, we sort of a potpourri today. So we're going to talk about error covariances. We're going to talk about residuals. And if there's time, I might actually talk tiny little bit, just give you a taste of what 3-level models look like. Again, you're not going to have to do any 3-level models for homework, but in some ways, it's just an easy extension of what we've done. But in other ways, it's a little bit cumbersome because we're going to have more notation and more tau matrices and all that kind of stuff. So that's the plan for today. Sound good? All right. I know, like I said, I know looking over there's no way we're going to cover every single piece of information there, but moving along. Okay, the other thing I want to say is, so some of you know matrix algebra, some of you don't know matrix algebra. A little bit of matrix algebra at the beginning of this discussion of covariance structures. If you don't know matrix algebra, don't worry about it. Like just kind of bear with me for a couple of slides where I sort of set the scene, and then we'll get into sort of the meat of what you really need to know. But I mean, there's sort of impossible to sort of set the stage without at least thinking about matrices a little bit. But I'm getting, again, I'm going to try to keep that to a minimum. All right. So we're talking about error covariance structures, specifically in longitudinal models. So, so far, and this will also be helpful because it's going to help you to see how all of the taus and sigma square kind of fit together to give us a composite residual matrix, which you can get a composite residual matrix for cross-sectional models too. I mean, it's just not, I mean, maybe it's the same kind of idea, maybe not quite as interesting. And we don't usually do alternative error covariance structures for cross-sectional models. So it makes sense to talk about this here, but again, this idea of a composite residual actually cuts across whether you have a longitudinal model or a cross-sectional model. But the idea of like really modeling different alternative covariance structures, that's pretty unique to longitudinal models. Again, I think for reasons you'll see in a minute. Okay, so let's just start with a simple linear growth model. You can see the PowerPoint up there, right? So this should all look pretty familiar. So we just have y at time t for person I, right, as a function of, we've got this randomly varying intercept and this randomly varying slope, which is getting multiplied by time. This is a simple linear growth model. So time is just going to be coded 0, 1, 2. If it's 3 time points, 0, 1, 2, 3, right? If it's 4 time points. So, and then we've got our combined model, right? And if you look at the combined model, right? If you look at the combined model, what have actually, not just, again, think back to regression class, had one residual, but in multi-level, we actually have intercept, we have the random slope, multiplied by time, and we've got this level 1. So something called composite residual. And here I'm just calling it R sub ij in the that this is all of these residuals put together, right? So, I've broken apart my residuals. But you can imagine that I want to put all of my residuals, it's going to be a matrix. Again, it's not going to be, but I want to put my residuals back together, or I'm going to have composite. So, and again, we're used to thinking about the fixed effects and the random effects. But so think about sort of the random effects plus the E sub ti, that becomes your composite residual. So far, so good? Okay. All right. So now, again, this is where you just have to kind of bear with it. So here we have like 2 people. Should have crossed 4 times. Like person 1 at time. Two at time 1, and these are the residuals, right? But what I'm showing, this is actually 2 different people across 4 time points. So remember, you got, like, think about this as you're going to have residuals for each person, right, across each time point. And, you know, the normal assumption that we would make about residuals, like in an OLS framework, is that residuals would be normally distributed with a mean of 0 and a constant variance. So what that would really be saying is like, oh, okay, we can think about normally distributed. This is just, again, like a mean vector of 0. Mean of 0 and constant variance. And the thing to really just key in here is basically on the diagonals, right? We're saying we've got variance, residuals, and it's the same. All right. And actually, at this point, you can just think about this as, well, we can just think about these as the level 1 residuals too. But with longitudinal data, they are independent across people. But within people, I don't necessarily think that that this residual structure is going to be like independent within person, right? So like sigma squared, actually, we're saying is normally distributed with mean 0 and constant variance. Normally, that's our normal assumption. But when we put the composite residual all together and we've got E and we've got, you know, R, right, for the intercept, we've got the random effect for the intercept and the random effect for the slope. I'm not actually thinking that I'm going to have like within person independence, which makes sense because I do think that people's scores across time are going to be correlated. And that's kind of the key thing to remember is that think about people's scores across time for a longitudinal model. And I don't actually think that there's going to be sort of 0 correlation across time, right? So composite residuals are independent across people. Well, compute this composite residual. Don't think, and that's what this means, right? We don't think that like there's going to be, you know, any relationship between like, let's say my own little composite residual matrix or whatever and somebody else's. But within person, I do think actually that sort of expect heteroscedasticity. What does that mean? It means maybe the variances across time, I don't actually expect to be exactly the same, right? Like, and again, a good example of this is imagine reading scores across time with little kids. Do you think that there's more or less variance in reading scores as you go from like kindergarten to first grade to second grade to third grade? More, right? So we don't necessarily, so that's sort of part of it, right? So across time, we might expect heteroscedasticity of the variances. And we also expect that again, these sort of within person residuals are going to be correlated across time. So what this is just saying is like, okay, there's some sort of like, I can think about this sort of composite residual matrix. That's what we call block diagonal, because I've got this like little, you know, I've got this block in here, right, that is not where there's stuff going on. And then there's gonna, this is this block for like person 1. There's going to be a block for person 2. And you could, again, you could imagine there'd be a block for person 3 and a block for person 4 and a block for person 5. And there'd basically be this, you know, huge matrix with blocks for every person. And that's our block diagonal matrix. And again, if that seems weird to you, don't worry about it. Don't get too hung up on it. But that's kind of the structure. We're just going to, in a minute, just zoom in on one block and just worry about one block. Big picture. Okay. So I think I've said all this, right? Yeah. So we're sort of expecting that the blocks of the error covariance matrix be identical across people. So we're not actually going to fit a separate error covariance matrix for each person. I just said there's a block for each person, but imagine if I tried to, you could like think about how many parameters that would be if you tried to fit a separate one of those little blocks for each person. So we're not going to do that. we're going to assume that all of those blocks are the same across people, but then we're going to actually figure out what is the structure of this this block. So again, that's why I say, like, you can now zoom in and just say, okay, well, the structure is going to be the same across all people. So let's just think about one block, because that one block is going to be the same across all people, right? So basically what we're saying is these composite residuals, they can be heteroscedastic and dependent within people, but the entire error structure is repeated identically across people. So everybody's residuals are identically heteroscedastic and autocorrelated. Cool. All right. Got it? All right. That's the same slide again. Okay. So this is that block diagonal matrix that I was talking about. Okay. But again, now we're just going to zoom in and we're just going to think about one block. And this is for 3 waves of data. And we actually started to think about this a little bit when I talked about how many random effects you can have. Remember how I said you can only have one fewer random effect than time points? And I said, so think about, remember I said, take a matrix, like think about making a little matrix with the, like, as many rows and columns as you have time points. Well, this matrix is going to, that's this matrix. The composite residual matrix actually has the dimensions of basically like a T by T matrix, where T is the number of time points. So this is an example where we have 3 waves of data. So it, and again, that kind of makes sense if you go back to what I was just talking about with the block diagonal matrix, right? So, but just remember, this is a T by T matrix. So it's a, here it's a 3 by 3 matrix because there are 3 time points. If I had 4 time points, it would be a 4 by 4 matrix. And what I'm going to try to do is, what we're going to try to do is say, what is the structure of the composite residual matrix with 3 time points? Now, heretofore, we've talked a lot about the structure of the tau matrix, right? So you're going to see that the decisions that we make about the tau matrix are totally going to play into then what the structure of this composite matrix looks like. But let's just start with, like, what are some possibilities? Okay, so the most, like, free, most parameterized, most complex, sort of most freely estimated possibility would be to just say, I want to estimate each of these elements of this composite residual matrix as unique. Like, I'm not going to put any constraints on it. So the constraint is that the composite is equal. But in terms of, and you know what, I'm just going to cross these out just to remind ourselves that these are repeats, right? So we remember how many we have. But within person, I could say, I just want to allow these composite residuals, like, to be whatever. This variance could be different from this variance, could be different from this variance, and these covariances could be all different from each other. And so, like, how many variables will be adding if I said I want to estimate this composite residual matrix as completely unstructured? How many unique elements are there in this matrix? 6, right? So if I estimated this matrix as completely unstructured, I'd be estimating 6 parameters, right? That would be like 6 residual pieces. Say it, but like 6 residual pieces. Okay, now let's remember what we were just talking about with the linear model. When I run a standard linear model, let's assume it's a standard linear model. If I run, and because I've got 3 time points, can't be anything more than linear, right? So let's assume I've got a standard linear model and the intercept is randomly varying and slope is randomly varying. And I also have sigma squared, right? I have that within person error variance term. So when I run a standard HLM model, how many how many variance, covariance components do I have in a standard HLM model? My tau matrix, again, my tau matrix looks like this, right? Tau naught naught, tau 1 1, tau naught 1, and I still have sigma squared. Right? I'm not literally adding those together right now. I'm just saying that's what we've got. So how many elements, how many variance covariance elements do I have? 4, right. So here I've got 4 parameters. So think about it this way. If I were to impose no structure at all on this composite residual matrix, it would be, I would be estimating 6 parameters. That would be freely estimating basically each one of these pieces. So I could just let them be whatever they are. But that's not what I'm doing when I run a standard linear model. When I run a standard linear model, I'm saying, I think I can reproduce those 6 pieces with 4 parameters. That's like literally what I'm doing. So I can't have more than 6 parameters. 6 would be completely unstructured. But when I run a linear model and I have a randomly varying intercept and a randomly varying slope, and I allow them to covary with each other, and I've got a sigma squared, I'm basically saying, I think I can take these 4 parameters and I can do a good enough job reproducing this composite residual matrix. Sort of like, yeah, I'm going to date myself because this show even when I was young, but there used to be this game show. It was like old, I can't remember what it was called. Name that tune, that's what it's called. And they would play like the first 4 notes, or actually I think they had to bet with each other, like, do you think you can name that tune? How many notes do you think you need to be able to name? You remember this show, huh? No,
it's a newer version now.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, okay. Not in my year. I know. But anyway, so first they bet on, I think I can name that tune in 4 notes, right? And then they try to do it. Well, this is kind of like that. Imagine this is the tune. Like, if you had no structure at all, like this is the most parameterized, going to be sort of fit the best, right? Like this is like all the parameters or not parameters. I mean, this is all the pieces that we're trying to kind of model in this composite matrix. 6 is the number. 6 is the number of unique elements in this composite residual matrix. What I'm saying is, when I run the linear model, I'm like, hey, I think I can do a good enough job coming up with these 6 elements, just 4 pieces of information, right? Now, I mean, theoretically, you could, maybe you think you can do a good enough job reproducing the residual covariance matrix with like, just 1 residual, right? Something. I mean, that's possible, right? We'll talk about some other structures, but here what we're really saying is I've got 4 parameters, and I think I can use those 4 parameters to do a good enough job reproducing this composite residual matrix that actually has 6 unique elements in the matrix. And that is why this is like, remember we talked about this a little bit last week, or not last week, maybe it was 2 weeks ago now, but this is how it kind of relates back to what we were talking about. That's why this is over-identified, right? And you can sort of think about this idea of like, I've got, sort of, you want to think about them as 2 degrees of freedom, sort of, right? We don't have to think of them as degrees of freedom necessarily, but they are. Like I could be estimating 6 things and I'm over-identified, which means when again, for those of you who've taken SEM, this probably makes even more sense than for those of you who haven't, but what it means is I can never probably do a perfect job reproducing 6 pieces of information with these 4 parameters, right? But again, can I get close enough? That's the question. If I start with 6 parameters, if I fit the unstructured matrix, I can do a perfect job, right? Like it's, again, think back to algebra, right? Like if I have like 1 unknown, right? If I've got like one unknown and one equation, or two unknowns and two equations, like I can solve perfectly. If I have the same number of knowns and unknowns, I can perfectly fit this composite residual matrix. So using an unstructured composite residual matrix will always be like the best fitting, but it's also really, really, really not parsimonious. And it doesn't, lend itself. I mean, it's so not parsimonious, it becomes sort of problematic too, because I now no longer, I'm estimating each element of this residual matrix, composite matrix, but I now no longer really have like a randomly varying slope and a randomly varying intercept, which are kind of nice from an interpretability standpoint. So like, yeah, this will fit the best, but it's not at all parsimonious. So from an explanatory perspective, it leaves a little something to be desired. But so if I can do just about as good a job, right, here with these 4 parameters as I do with the 6 parameters, I'm definitely going to favor the solution that has, where I only need 4 parameters. Okay, is everybody with me so far? I know this is a little bit heady, but all right. All right, so I've said all this, that we have 4 parameters, right? The level 1 residual. That's in the covariance. Now, the standard HLM model then imposes, and this is really imposes a really particular structure on the composite residual within person matrix. I'm going to take those elements that I have, those 3 taus and that sigma squared, and I'm going to do some math, and that's what's going to give me this composite residual matrix. Okay? So what does that look like? And this is, I think, important to understand, because sometimes people have this real misunderstanding and think that wrong ideas in your head. But this is how it works. And again, if you don't know matrix algebra, you can just trust me that I do the matrix multiplication and addition correctly. But if I want to create that model implied residual covariance matrix across the waves, now I've switched, I have 4 waves here, which is going to match with the handout too. So imagine I have 4 time points. So now actually my composite residual matrix would be like a 4 by 4, right? Instead of a 3 by 3. So if I want to actually sort of reproduce that 4 by 4 composite residual matrix using a standard linear model, and I have, just again, this is my unstructured tau matrix, right? How am I going to kind of reproduce this? Well, I actually, again, under the scene, the math what's going on is I'm going to take, this is like my design matrix here, actually design matrix for the random effects. So but again, it should look really familiar to you from what we've done with longitudinal modeling, right? This is the intercept. Remember, the intercept is like a column of 1s. And then remember, for the linear slope, like 0, 1, 2, 3. So this should look to you just like the codes that you're using actually to fit a linear growth model, right? So I take this, I multiply it by my tau matrix, and then I multiply it by this same thing, the transpose of this, and that just really means that I'm sort of flipping it. So the transpose really means that it gets flipped like that, and that's for matrix multiplication reasons, and we're not going to worry too much about that. And then the sigma squared, this gets multiplied by sigma squared matrix where sigma squared, block diagonal matrix where sigma squared is in the diagonal, and there are zeros on the off diagonal. Okay. So if I do that math, this is what I get. Ta-da! Aren't you? Okay. So yeah, trust me on the matrix. I mean, I'll show you a little bit line by line, but You trust me on the matrix multiplication, but take a look at this for a second. So what this means is still at 4 parameters because it was a linear model. I have 10 unique elements of this residual variance covariance matrix because it's a 4 by 4, right? And with 4 parameters, I'm saying I can take those 4 parameters and I can recreate the 10 unique elements of the residual variance covariance matrix just with those 4 parameters. And you can see, right? I'm getting a really interesting structure. So I've got like tau naught plus sigma squared is my variance, my residual variance at time 1. Notice that at time 2, it's tau naught plus 2 tau naught 1 plus tau 1 plus sigma squared. So it's clearly, like, look at this, are the same. Those are added in. So let's assume that the covariance between the slope and the intercept is positive right now. So tau naught 1 is positive. What does that mean about how big this will be as compared to this? Tau naught 1 positive. Which of these numbers is, I mean, I don't know what these numbers are, right? But which of these numbers is going to be bigger? This one? This one. The second one, it has to be, right? Tau 1 is a variance, so it has to be positive. It could be something close to 0, but it has to be positive. And if I say that tau naught 1 is positive, then this is going to be 2 times whatever that covariance is, right? So that's going to be positive. So this is going to be bigger than this by how much? Well, by 2 times tau naught 1 plus tau 1, right? And then if I look here, I've got the same thing going on, right? So I've got the same sort of things here. Now I've actually got 4 tau naught 1 plus 4 tau 1. So again, assuming tau naught 1 is positive, which of these is going to be bigger? That one, right? Okay, you're seeing the pattern here. And then finally, there we go. Finally, you can see here, again, assuming tau naught 1 is positive, this is going to be bigger still, right? Because now I've got 6 tau naught 1 plus 9 tau 1. So what's really interesting is, again, this is all kind of like hidden inside our tau matrix and our sigma squared, but we are actually estimating a composite, when we just do a standard multi-level model, we're actually estimating a composite residual matrix in which we're saying, yeah, the variance in, again, if tau naught 1 is positive, we're fitting a residual variant, residual composite residual matrix variance, composite residual variance covariance matrix, a lot of words, in which the variances are actually getting bigger across time. Yeah, if tau naught 1 is positive. Tau naught 1 is negative. It's going to depend, because it's going to depend on like the magnitude of tau 1 then, right? Because, right? So, but certainly if tau naught 1 is positive, which is, pretty common, then we're going to see that these variances, right, are getting bigger across time. So that makes sense? So that's really interesting. So like, that's interesting because what we're really saying is like, oh, we're not actually constraining that composite residual variance to be the same across time. We're allowing it to actually be heterogeneous. And again, and then if you look here on the up diagonal, a different color, you can see we're certainly not saying that within person there's no correlation between, like, again, imagine this as being, the residuals again, but like this is time 1 and time 2. So this is like the covariance between time 1 and time 2. Residual covariance, right? This is not going to give me the actual correlations across time because these are the, this is the residual matrix, but be that as it may, it's still it's still the residual covariance between time 1 and time 2. And you can see, okay, so that's tau naught naught plus tau naught 1. Okay, pretty simple. Now look at the residual covariance between time 2 and time 3. Again, if we assume that tau naught 1 is positive, what do we see? That residual covariance between time 2 and time 3 is actually going to be larger, right, than the residual covariance between time 1 and time 2. And the same thing is going to be true here. The residual covariance between time 3 and 4 is going to be bigger than the residual covariance between time 2 and time 3, which is going to be bigger than the residual covariance between time 1 and time 2. Again, in a very particular structure. I mean, like this is the frame, like this is the, again, the way we're sort of setting that it will be bigger. But you can see that we're allowing for that to be bigger. And the same thing is true here, right? These covariances are getting bigger. And if you look down, you can see that, right, we're sort of getting the same kind of pattern where actually, you know, this covariance is going to be bigger than that covariance, right? So there's a very particular structure that we're actually imposing on this residual variance covariance matrix. It's not a structure. I think sometimes, you know, it's a pretty, I mean, specific but interesting residual structure in which we're allowing the variances to increase across time. We're allowing the covariances to increase across time, and they're actually like, you know, they're increasing in sort of, you know, interesting ways. All right, and what we're saying is I can recreate these 10 unique elements of this residual matrix with just those 4 parameters, 3 random effects and the sigma squared. And this is how or not 3 random effects, I'm sorry, 3 taus, the 3 taus and the sigma squared. And this is how basically we kind of put the taus and the sigma squareds back together again to get sort of just one composite residual matrix. Okay. Any questions about any of that? Does that make sense? So far, so good? All right. Yeah.
This is what we should also be thinking. The errors larger or models.
Yeah. Right. And again, I mean, and remember that like we don't know what these numbers are. So like tau naught 1 could, I mean, theoretically, tau naught 1 could be 0, right? I mean, you could estimate tau 1 could be 0 for that matter too. And so like if tau naught 1 ended up being 0, obviously then this would simplify and the structure would look a little different, right? If tau, the bigger, like as these numbers change, sort of the magnitudes of the differences are going to change, right? So there is some flexibility in this because we're actually estimating all of these numbers, right? But yeah, I mean, this is, and also with the caveat that this is our residual matrix, so you can't just look at your correlation matrix across time and be like, oh, well, I know what I need this to look like because these are residuals, but yeah, we should be thinking about this. We should be thinking about whether, you know, like whether this structure kind of makes sense. And it's an interesting, I mean, the standard HLM structure, like it gets, I feel like it gets kind of, you know, it kind of gets like a bad rap sometimes when people fit longitudinal models and, you know, if you're not considering alternative error covariance structures, sometimes people be like, well, you know, you just did the standard HLM model. But I mean, yes, it's a particular structure, but there is a fair amount of flexibility in this structure, and it's not a structure that is imposing, for example, it's not saying all the variances have to be equal. It's not saying all the covariances have to be equal, or that there are no covariances. Like there are a lot of other structures out there that would be way more like unforgiving. We're going to talk about some of those in a minute. So yes, this is a specific structure. You know, sometimes this specific structure is going to fit better than other times. It's a little hard to look at it, I grant you, and be like, oh, I can totally see what that composite residual covariance matrix is going to look like, and nobody expects you to be able to do that. But what I do want you to understand is that we are allowing for covariances to vary across time and variances to vary across time. We're just doing it with a very specific structure. You with me so far? Cool. So, oops. Okay, so I'm going to actually skip through the next two slides where I just kind of show exactly how you get the elements that I had in that matrix. But for the sake of time, I will skip through that. All right. So again, just to kind of recap, right? You know, we can think about this covariance. Kind of look back at our covariance matrix. Covariance actually contains the product of pairs of times, which is really going to affect the error covariance when the time values are large. So, oh, actually, maybe I should go back. And just sort of point that out. We can see it on our matrix, right? See how this is blowing up? For example, like we've got tau 1, you know, again, it's like a quadratic. We've got tau 1, now we've got 4 tau 1, now we've got 9 tau 1. What do you notice? That there's totally a pattern here, right? That tau 1 on the diagonal is actually going to be basically like it's going to be that time variable. Remember, we had 0, 1, 2, 3. It's that squared actually gets multiplied by tau 1. So you can see that like tau 1, as time gets bigger, this is going to get bigger and bigger, right? Because it's going to be like, well, the next one would be like 16 tau 1, 25 tau 1, right? And here you're going to see there's also a pattern with the tau 1s. So with the covariances. So, you know, if the level 2 variances are really close to 0, then the composite residual covariances are going to be near 0. So like if you actually fit a model and let's say tau not and tau 1 actually were 0, which would mean tau not 1 would have to be 0. So you don't have any taus, right? If you had no taus, then actually the matrix that you would get would just basically be sigma squared on the diagonal, right? And if that were the case, by the way, then regular ordinary least squared regression assumptions would apply, because like ordinary least square regression makes the assumption that you basically just have this diagonal matrix with sigma squared, you know, on the diagonal, all the same sigma squared and nothing on the off diagonal. So if tau 1 and tau not 1 were 0, so think about that. So there's no slope variance. Imagine that's what this would be saying. There's no variability across people in terms of their growth. So if that were the case, tau 1 and tau not 1 would both be 0, right? And then in that case, the composite residual covariance matrix is actually going to take on a constant value of tau not. Let's just look here for a second. Oh, maybe not that one. That's ugly. Okay, right? So imagine if tau 1 and tau not 1 were 0, you're going to be getting rid of all of this stuff. And so what would you end up with? Have like tau not 1 plus sigma squared, 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 tau not, why am I saying tau not 1? Tau not plus sigma squared all along the diagonal, and on the off diagonals, you just have tau not, right? So if you were to fit a linear growth model and you say, people can vary in terms of where they start, but they can't vary in terms of how fast they grow, then you would have a much, much, much simpler composite matrix that basically there you'd be saying, I can reproduce this composite residual matrix with just 2 elements. And so let's take a look at, I actually have that. Well, okay. Let me go skip over. Okay, here it is. You'll sometimes see it written these are identical. You'll sometimes see it written this way, which I think maps on to what we were just talking about. So you've got sigma squared plus tau naught naught, right? And sometimes you'll see it written this way. So it's like sigma squared, and then there's some sort of a row, which is like some sort of a covariance times sigma squared. So let me back up for one sec. Okay. So, we could actually estimate the autocorrelations among the composite residuals, by the way, just the same way that we would compute, correlations normally, right? A correlation is just going to be the covariance between two things divided by the square root of the two variances. Okay. So, again, we might want something that's even more flexible than the multi-level sort of the HLM, the standard HLM composite residual structure. And I'm going to talk about some ways that we could make things more flexible. If we were in SEM, it would be really easy, right? Because I could just like correlate. I could say, oh, I'm just going to correlate the errors between time 2 and time 3 and allow for that covariance to be bigger than everything else. We don't have that same flexibility of being able to sort of tinker quite as easily, but there are other ways that we can tinker with this covariance structure. Okay. So how many people have heard of sphericity? Is this something you talked about in stats class? Yeah. Okay. So sphericity, the sphericity assumption, this comes up a lot in like standard repeated measures ANOVA. It means that the variances and the differences are equal. So if you meet the sphericity assumption, it means if you were to take the differences between time 1 and time, compute the variances of the difference. Got the difference between time 1 and time 2. What's the variance of that difference? Time 2 and time 3. What's the variance of that difference? And all those variances, the differences would be compound symmetry, which is another term that comes up a lot in repeated measures, but it's actually a sufficient condition for sphericity. So instead of actually looking at sphericity, we can just look at compound symmetry. And compound symmetry is a little easier to think about. It just says all the covariances are equal and all the variances are equal in the population being sampled. That's compound symmetry. So all the variances are equal and all the covariances are equal. Think about the matrix that I just showed you. When we don't allow the slope to randomly vary, right? When we're not actually allowing for random effect for the slope, where'd my picture go? There we go, right? All the covariances are equal and all the variances are equal. This is compound symmetry. So again, like a model that assumes compound symmetry is a model basically that says, oh, people can start at different points, but they have to grow at the same rate. If you force everybody to be growing at the same rate, you're actually going to be forcing the structure of compound symmetry, which again, might be reasonable in certain cases, might not be reasonable in other cases. So compound symmetry is basically saying all slopes are equal, we've got homogeneity of covariance, and we get that with no random effect for time. Now, again, if you were doing all of this kind of modeling, which you're never going to do again, please, I hope, in repeated measures ANOVA, right? Repeated measures ANOVA makes this assumption of sphericity or compound symmetry. And, in ANOVA, if you're violating those assumptions, your F tests are going to be too liberal, which means you're going to be making type 1 errors, right? So this is like one of many reasons that, random effects ANOVA is not a great way to go for modeling these kinds of data. Okay. All right. But again, we could model compound symmetry in our multi-level models. If this is really the structure we think that we need, it's really easy. We just don't allow the slope to randomly vary. Okay. So again, that's what I'm saying here. It's just totally equivalent to saying all of our people have the same slope. That will give us a compound symmetric variance covariance matrix. All right. I could also say, but So now we're going to talk about ways I could sort of make this a more complex covariance structure. I could say I want the level 1 residual variance. That's my sigma squared. Heretofore, we have always estimated just one sigma squared, right? So we've always assumed, remember what that is. The sigma squared is the within cluster error variance. And in the longitudinal case, that's the within person error variance, right? So it's like the within person residual variance. So I've got, right? Like how far my the residuals are now how far I am from like my own personal growth trajectory, right? And then I'm assuming though that the draw a picture of this actually. So imagine my person and remember that the level 1 residuals are like these guys, right? The distance of like the person's actual point from their own personal trajectory. And so when I estimate just one sigma squared, I'm saying that like, I think that this, sort of, can't imagine across all the people and everything, right? I think that the distances that we get at time 1, like the variances of the distances at time 1 between like a person's actual score and their trajectory, I think those are approximately equal to like the distances between the person's trajectory and their score at time 2, which are approximately equal to the distances between the person's score and their trajectory at time 3. And this is like across all people. So like here, it does look like for this person, this is, you're closer here, you're further here, and sort of in the middle here. But again, we're only getting one sigma squared, which is pooled across not just time points, but people. So imagine you think like, okay, it's okay to pool across people, but I actually think that like my line gets less, my trajectory is sort of less predictive of people's data points as they go further along, like in their trajectory. So what that would be saying is, again, we don't have this many data points, right? But it would be sort of this idea, we're like across all people. Imagine these are people's own personal trajectories, right? And across all people, I'd be saying something like this, like, I actually think that level 1 residuals are like tighter to the trajectories at time 1 than they are at time 3 or 4, or vice versa. It could go the other way, right? It could be, I think they're tighter at time 4 than they are at time 1. Does everybody follow the logic of what I'm saying? So if I think that's true, I could actually estimate a model in which I allow the variance to the level 1 residual variance to vary across time. So in this case, I'm actually, how many parameters am I estimating now? Like in the first case, remember I had 3 taus and a sigma squared. So I was reproducing 10 elements with, of my residual matrix with these 4 components. Now how many components do I have? I have 3 taus and, well, 4 sigma squareds, 3 additional ones, 3 more than I had before because I had 1 before. Now I have 3 taus and 4 sigma squareds, right? So I can sort of think about the number of parameters as being like the number of, random effects, right? These are our R's, our varying intercept or randomly varying slope, right? We can use this formula, R times R plus 1 divided by 2. So here this would be 2 times 3 divided by 2, which is 3. So because we've got 3 taus, and then T here is just the number of time points. So it'd be like 3 plus 4. Before it was like, I had this to count. I was saying, oh, it's the number of elements of the tau matrix plus 1 because I only have 1 sigma squared. And now I'm saying, no, I could allow sigma squared to be different across time points, in which case I'd actually be fitting a residual variance covariance matrix that has 7 unique elements. Could I do that and still be identified? if I have 4 time points? What's my upper limit? 10. Yeah, so I'd be fine. I can do that. I still have like, you know, 3. I'm still like over identified by 3 parameters, right? So it's 7 parameters here. I could have up to 10 parameters. So I could do that. No problem. So that's another possible thing I could do. I could allow for heterogeneous variance, like more flexible even than the standard HLN model. But it also is going to take more parameters, and I'm no longer just going to have 1 sigma squared. I'm going to have 4 sigma squared. So do I want that level of complexity? I don't know, right? Think twice. Like you need it, you need it, but you know, kind of hope we don't need it. Okay. So I just said all of that. Oh, I didn't say this. So here's kind of an interesting little fact. So remember how I said you can only have 1 fewer random effect than you have time points, right? So if we had 3 time points, we could have 2 random effects. 3 time points, remember I have 3 taus plus sigma squared, and I'm trying to use that to reproduce the six elements of my residual variance covariance matrix. But here's a kind of an interesting thing. I could allow for those variances to be heterogeneous across time. If I do that, then I would actually have 3 taus plus how many sigma squareds? If I have 3 time points, I'm going to have how many sigma squareds if I allow them to vary across time? 3. So 3 taus plus 3 sigma squareds is equal to 6. 6 is equal to 6. So now I am completely just identified, which means if I really wanted to fit an unstructured, like I wanted my composite residual matrix to be completely unstructured, but I didn't just want to like just make it completely unstructured because I wanted to also be able to talk about like randomly varying slopes and randomly varying intercepts. Nice little trick, if you will, to get basically to have as many elements, to be estimating as many elements as there are elements in your residual covariance matrix when you have as many random effects as time points minus 1, which is your max number of random effects that you could have. When you have the max number of random effects, if you allow all of those sigma squareds to if you allow sigma squared to randomly vary across time, or I shouldn't say randomly, not really what I mean. But if I allow sigma squared to vary across time, so I have as many sigma squareds as I have time points, I will get a just identified composite residual matrix, which basically is functionally identical to that unstructured matrix that we started out talking about. Just kind of cool. I think that's super cool because I think this is a much easier to interpret, but it is equally complex. Okay. All right. So, everybody with me so far? Okay, forget about heterogeneous variances for a second. Let's put that one away. There's another thing that often people will fit, especially in like time series models, different kinds of longitudinal models, something called a first order autoregressive model. And we talked about these again in SEM. Anybody who took SEM remembers we talked about first order autoregressive models. And the idea here is that, observations, measures that are closer in time are going to tend to have higher correlations with each other. And they actually have a particular sort of structure, like an autoregressive structure sort of says, for example, like if there are 2, like from time 1 to time 2, there's going to be like a correlation. This autoregressive correlation, let's say, let's just make it up. Let's say it's 0.8, right? And so that, so basically you're saying like there's a correlation of 0.8 from time 1 to time 2, but we're really making this assumption that this correlation is like, AR1 really means that like after controlling for the correlation of the prior time point, this guy is going to have no effect on time 3. So think about this as like just a standard like regression model. So what we're saying is after I control for time 2, there's no effect of like there's no correlation between time 1 and time 3. And so when we have an autoregressive component of 0.8, we're saying the correlation between time 1 and time 2 is 0.8, and the correlation between time 2 and time 3 is 0.8. And so actually what that means is the correlation between time 1 and time 3 is just 0.8 times 0.8, which is 0.64. If I had time 4, this would be another 0.8, and so we'd have 0.64 times 0.8, which is 0.5 and something. 5.2, I think, or something like that, 0.5-ish, and so on and so forth. So this AR1 is really saying like, okay, there is this autoregressive, there's this additional autoregressive term that is saying that time points that are closer together are more correlated, and obviously that also means that there's, time points that are further apart. This autoregressive component sort of means that those correlations are going to be kind of dampened across time. That's what we say. Getting smaller across time. So it's pretty common, actually. Again, remember how many times a minute ago about the compound symmetry model, where you've got basically a variance covariance matrix where you've got like tau plus sigma squared on the diagonal, and then you've got tau not on the off diagonal. So you're basically across there. So you're basically saying that they're, all these covariances are equal across time. Well, it's pretty common, but again, with longitudinal model, this often doesn't really fit very well. And so that's where people will often add an autoregressive component to the compound symmetry to get something that allows the occasions that are the residuals for the occasions that are closer in time to be more correlated to each other, and the residuals that are further away in time to be less correlated with each other. So an AR1 would basically be allowing there to be a row. And let me go to I've got a prettier slide rather than trying to write it on here. Here we go, much prettier. So if I took compound symmetry model and added an AR1, an autoregressive, first order autoregressive component, now I'd be saying I can estimate that variance covariance structure in just three elements: 1 sigma squared, 1 tau, and 1 rho. But you can see that basically for adjacent time points like 1 and 2, we're multiplying by rho, right? 1 and 2, 2 and 3, so 3 and 4. But now this is time points 1 and 3. So it's not rho anymore, it's rho squared, which is allowing for that, right? Which means that the correlation between time 1 and time 3 is obviously going to be lower than the correlation between time 1 and time 4. Going to be, because this is now cubed, is going to be lower than the correlation between time 1 and 3, which is going to be lower than the correlation between time 1 and 2, right? But I am saying then that this correlation, this covariance, right, is going to be the same as this one, right? And so you actually get something that's kind of like a band diagonal, where you're really saying that observations that are closer in time are going to be more. And this model, kind of interesting if you think about it, like this model is fitting that composite residual structure with 3 parameters, whereas the standard multi-level model that I showed you that had that really complex sort of structure, that takes 4 parameters. So, I mean, this is 1 fewer parameter. It's simpler in that regard, but maybe it's, again, maybe it's too simple. Okay. All right, theoretically, you could combine the autoregressive 1 structure with the standard HLM structure because, right? Remember, I was only using four parameters, right? Yeah, sorry. I was only using 4. I have 3 taus and 1 sigma squared. So here I could add an AR1 term. Now I've changed the structure of this composite residual matrix. And so now I need 5 parameters to estimate the 10 elements instead of 4 parameters, but I'm allowing for there to be an AR1 structure on top of the standard multi-level structure. Now, the truth is that, like, before people used multi-level models and they were using other kinds of longitudinal models that required the assumption of compound symmetry, it was really important to build in, it was often really important to build in the AR1 component because it was totally unrealistic to assume that all of the off-diagonal elements in this residual matrix had equal covariances. But because the standard HLM model doesn't make that assumption, because it actually has a pretty elaborated, set of covariances that are getting, sort of bigger across time, again, in particular ways, I would argue that the AR1 structure with the standard HLM structure is not always necessary. Like, pretty hard to get a real compound symmetric structure that fits, but like you don't necessarily need to do this, but you could. Adds 1 more parameter and it gives more flexibility to this compound residual. And then finally, as I said, the very most flexible possibility of all is just to say I'm going to estimate every element of this composite residual variance covariance matrix separate. Like, if you do this, by the way, you don't have taus anymore. Like, taus are what's making this, like, that tau matrix is what's making the simplifying assumptions. So when you do this, you'd be like, no, I'm not talking to you. When you do this, this would take the place of a tau matrix. You just be like, hey, I want to estimate all of the elements of the composite residual. Again, it will fit perfectly, but it's not very parsimonious. And from from an interpretability standpoint, the lack of parsimony, sometimes when things aren't parsimonious, like, why do we not like non-parsimonious stuff? Because, if you can't simplify, if you have to consider every little like dimple and pimple and every little like bauble, right, then it gets really hard to like generalize, to make any sense of anything, right? So the same thing is true here. Yeah, very, very unrestricted, but doesn't really allow us to say anything very interesting about, like, are people randomly varying in terms of their slopes? Are they randomly varying in terms of their intercepts? What we're just saying is, we're going to estimate all of these elements all separately. Okay, so again, this formula just tells us how many unique elements there are in the variance covariance matrix of like the composite residual variance matrix. You can think of the T as the number of time points. So it's just the number of time points divided by 2. So for example, if I have a model and 5 time points, 5 times 6 divided by 2, that means my composite residual has 15. And this always puts the upper bound on how many taus, sigma squares, rhos, whatever, how many things you can be using to estimate that composite residual. All right. All right. So last slide, I think, on all of this. So I'm not going to show you today how to do any of this in LME4 because, unfortunately, LME4, for all of the advantages that it has, it doesn't actually allow for fitting alternative variance covariance structures for residuals. So the various forms of heteroscedasticity and autocorrelation that we just talked about. We are obviously getting the standard multi-level structure. Like you were getting that and you didn't even know it. So now today you know what the standard structure is. But there, and I should say, like, there are people online who have shown ways that you can, it's pretty complicated, but there are ways you can trick LME4 into actually doing this for you. It involves kind of getting into the guts a little bit. You can't just do it. Yeah, we're not doing that today. Promise. So you're like, the easiest thing to do is to go back to, if you want to stay in R. I mean, you can go to some other package too, right? But if you want to stay in R, the easiest thing to do is to go to a package that's called NLME, which is also written by Doug Bates. And so it's very similar, or he's one of the co-authors of both packages. It's actually an older package than LME4. There are some, computational advantages that LME4 has, but again, it sort of sacrificed the ability to kind of have the flexibility on the covariance structure side. So if you really want to estimate these models, you can use NLME. The syntax is slightly different. I mean, in a lot of ways it's similar, but it is a different syntax than LME4. So we're not going to go into the syntax of that either today. But I think, like, if you really want to do this, I don't think you'll find the syntax if you really understand multi-level modeling, you won't find the syntax to be that cumbersome. But just sort of know that we can't actually estimate most of these alternative covariance structures in LME4. And I would say actually, like, that's one of the biggest in my mind, because I geek out on covariances. It's like my jam. So in my mind, that's one of the biggest disadvantages of LME4, but not of R in general, again, because there are other packages. No, you said you can't, right? Yeah. So definitely can do this in NLME. If you fit models in Stata, you can fit multi-level models in Stata, and there are options for alternative variance covariance structures. Weirdly, there are even in SPSS options for alternative variance covariance structures in multi-level modeling. Certainly in HLM there are too. So it's really kind of just a function. It's just really an LME4 thing. But again, I think that decision was made for computational reasons that are good. Okay, we're doing on time. All right, that's all I want to say about error covariance structures. You with me? Yeah. Sure. How far beyond the spot? Okay.
If you're
Question.
I'm trying.
Should absorb. I'm going to say it's all important because that's my job. But no, I know what you're saying. To be serious, I understand what you're saying. And like, I certainly think that for the vast majority of people in here who aren't in our program, some of this matrix stuff probably went right over your head, and that is fine, and that is good. That's fine. I think, though, what I would hope that you would take away from this is that, like, when we fit a multi-level model, we are actually imposing a particular structure on, well, first thing I would hope you would take away from this is, like, gosh, all semester we've been talking about taus and sigmas, or sigma, one sigma, but they actually do fit together into this composite residual matrix, right? So like that I think is a nice tie-in at the end of the semester to say, like, oh, all this stuff kind of comes together. And then the second thing I would hope that you would take away is the multi-level model makes a very particular, but also somewhat flexible. I mean, it's like it imposes a very particular structure on the variance, the composite residual variance covariance matrix. And I didn't show what happens like when you have a quadratic term, but like as you add other randomly varying slopes, actually the structure gets way more complicated because any of the randomly varying slopes are going to, you're going to have another column in the design matrix, and then you're going to have a bigger tau matrix. And so this is going to get bigger and more elaborated. But like, so So it's a particular structure, but it's also relatively flexible. So like the thing that, again, I'll just say it, like my pet peeve is that there are a lot of people who don't actually understand that this is the composite residual structure. And like, I should not do this. I'll never forget, this is like 15 years ago now, so the person is long gone. There was like a post, I think it was about 15 years ago, there was a postdoc who was interviewing for a position here and was talking about some multi-level modeling stuff and was basically saying that that it's not, that basically that multi-level models just impose, he was sort of saying like, sort of implying that multi-level models impose, like growth models impose compound symmetry, or like maybe even said that you just have very, sort of he wasn't understanding this composite residual matrix, right? So he was sort of saying that like, it's very limited longitudinal models, like what's being imposed by the standard multi-level model. And so, he was doing something else. I forget exactly what he was doing. But anyway, so he's talking about the residuals, and he was completely wrong because he was sort of assuming, as people often do, I think, because they see this thing that says like the level 1 residuals, right? The sigma squareds, like the level 1 residuals are relatively simple, but they get paired with the taus to come up with this composite matrix. And so, coming out. So I raised my hand and I was like, well, I'm really confused about what you're saying, And then he said, and I asked a question about it. And then he said, because he didn't know who I was, it's a multi-level thing. Kind of like you wouldn't understand. I was so torqued because it was like, no, you don't understand what you're talking about, dude. So the great end of the story is, so then in the afternoon, there's a postdoc interview with the PIs. It was like, I think it's like a special ed school site kind of thing. The PIs, and I was brought in as the methodologist that he'd be working on it with the postdoc, right? And so he comes in the room and they introduce me, and he was just like, shit. And then I proceeded to school him on why what he said in his talk was wrong. So anyway, so I just want you to understand that even though we've only got one sigma squared, so there is only one level 1 residual, that doesn't mean that we don't have a relatively flexible and articulated composite residual structure, but maybe sometimes it might not be good enough. So that I would expect you to understand. And then, would I expect you to be able to rattle off the top of your head? Because I don't think I could have the slides in front of me, like what that flexible but specific structure is, across all the waves of data. No, of course not. But to understand conceptually, sort of like there's some flexibility, but there's also some structure. And if that doesn't seem reasonable, then the methodologist could consider thinking about other types of ways to model that composite residual matrix. But I would say, after all is said and done, that the standard HLM structure actually works. I mean, it works, it's like a little funky looking, but it actually works surprisingly well for many, many longitudinal models. So the good news is that even though we have just been thinking about our taus and our sigma squared, we don't necessarily have to go down this path on an everyday regular basis. But there are times where you have very specific, again, it's like all content, everything we do with data is content specific. So there are times when you might have very specific kinds of data with a structure where this might not be adequate. And that would be a time that you would turn to your methodologist and say, okay, I don't remember all the details, but I kind of think for multi-level modeling class that there are other ways that we could think about conceptualizing the residuals. Can you go down that path and bring back some solutions and see if that's a useful thing here? Right? Does that make sense?
Yep. Thank you.
Right. Okay, other questions? All right. We're doing on time. So do I want to say anything about 3-level models or not?
Yeah.
I can do it in 10 minutes. We'll see. Yeah, I can do it in 10 minutes. I'm just going to give you broad brushstrokes here. You'll see why we're not going to go into well, I'll show you what's cool and I'll show you what's, okay. 3-level models. If you don't like subscripts, they're not for you. That's, I promise you, I swear to you, I will not put anything on the final requiring you to do notation for 3-level models. I promise. Once you see this, you'll see why I say that. Okay, so 3-level models, right? Now we've got, another level to our hierarchy. Organizationally, it could be students nested in classes, nested in schools. I mean, the problem is once you start thinking this way, you can have a 4-level model. Students nested in classrooms, nested within schools, nested within districts, right? Or if we've got over time data, it could be observations across time nested within students, nested within schools, right? Or that's another 3-level. You can have either organizational or longitudinal 3-level models. It's really common, actually, if you're working in the educational space and longitudinal models, you're probably going to need a 3-level because you probably are going to have people clustered within schools, right? Have overtime data, but the people are not independent. So you're almost guaranteed to need a 3-level model for longitudinal school-based models. Okay, so what does this look like? Woo! A whole other set of subscripts. Awesome. Let's call our next subscript. So we've got YIJ. So this is an organizational model, by the way. So we've got the predicted score for person I in class J in school K as an example, right? Cluster system. And so here we've got, this by the way is totally unconditional model. No predictors at all, right? Just completely unconditional model. So now, but you'll notice actually, even though this is an organizational model, it's pretty common to use pies at level 1 and betas at level 2 and gammas at level 3, at least in the Rodenbush and Bright notation. So even though this isn't longitudinal, like pi is level 1 in the 3-level model. So again, so right now we've got a level 1 residual, a level 2 residual, and now we've got a level 3 residual because, think about what we're saying here. We're saying this person's score is a function of, right? This is their random, there's some class mean or class intercept, but in this case it's unconditional, so we can say class mean, right? Plus the difference between their residual is the difference between them and their class mean, and now I can predict their class intercept or their class mean based on their school intercept, which is their school mean, plus now, right? So the class, there's some deviation between the school and the class. That's what this is. And so now this is kind of interesting. So this is now within class variance, which it would have been as well if we just had kids within classes. But now this is no longer, when I take the variance of this is no longer, it's no longer between class variance. It's between class within school variance, right? Because it's how much does your class deviate from the school average? How much does your class average deviate from the school average? That's really what we're getting at here, right? And now this is how much does your school deviate from the overall expected? So maybe it would have been better to go down, maybe instead of up, right? So we've got, okay, this is my school's mean or my school's intercept. How is that different from gamma naught, which is the overall mean, right? And then I've got the school mean plus this deviation, this residual tells me how much, how does my class relate to the school mean, right? Here, so this is that residual. And then I take this class mean plus some error, and that gives me the person score, right? So now we have really these 3 sources of variance, even for the unconditional model. We've got the variance between people within classes. That's level 1 here because people are a level 1. Level 2 is the variance between classes, and this is the really important part, between classes within schools. And the level 3 variance is now the between school variance. So I now am partitioning my variance into 3 pieces. within class, cross classes within schools, or you could imagine that could be across teachers within schools too, right? And then across schools. Sure. I've got these three sources of variance. The first is within classes, between people within classes. The second is between classes, or you could think of that as between teachers, right, within schools. And then the third is between schools. And so what does that mean in terms of the remember my good old interclass correlation coefficient? So remember in the two-level model, the ICC is always tau naught divided by tau naught plus sigma squared. But now I've actually got these three components, right? So what am I going to have for variances here? Well, the variance in this is going to be what I call tau naught pi. And the variance here is tau naught beta. Kind of makes sense, right? Because the pi's are at level 1, the betas are at level 2. So I'm calling this tau naught pi and tau naught beta. So now I have three sources of variance. I'm partitioning the variance into three pieces. Within class, between classes, but within schools, and between schools. And the total variance is going to be sigma squared plus tau naught pi plus tau naught beta. So okay, so far so good. That's not too bad, right? So, okay. Oh, wait. Yeah, no, that's fine. I said all that. Okay, so then in terms of the interclass correlation coefficient, though, I got three pieces. So I really have sort of multiple ICCs, if you will. I can think about like the proportion of variance. So I can take this unconditional model and I can say, what proportion of variance is at level 1? So what proportion of the variance is between students within, right, just between students with classes? And that would just be sigma squared divided by my three components, right? So notice the denominator is always the same here. And then, or I could say what proportion of variance is, so really here it would be like at level 2. So it's really like, between classes within schools, right? And then here, the proportion of variance at level 3 is between schools. And for each of these components, I'm just going to take the variance component that talking about between school variance. Then I'm going to take the tau beta naught and just divide it by the total variance. So the logic is the same. The total variance is in the denominator. And then, but the thing is, I don't have just one ICC. I really have like what proportion of variance lies between classes within schools. What proportion of variance lies between schools? That's this one, yeah.
Did you just squared was the two towns added together?
No.
Oh.
I did certainly not. Okay. I don't think I said that. No, I said the total variance is the sigma squared and the two that taus added together.
Which was that?
Yeah. So it's like all three of these things is what if I can see how the way I said it quickly sounded like I was, but yeah, I was just saying add these three things together, that's your total variance. So, and this is kind of interesting too, because once you start looking at these models, it can be really interesting to see like, how the variance is really between teachers within a school. How much of the variance is actually really between school variance. So that's like, if you only looked at teachers, you might think, oh, like between teacher variance, but you might find once you put school in that actually school, it's really school. Like there's they're explained by school, and once you look at the teachers within a school, maybe they don't explain nearly as much of the sort of variance as you might think. Okay. With an unconditional linear growth model, so A here is just like our time variable. A was like the same and just have another set of subscripts, and here I'm calling them Ti and J because it's time nested within individual, nested in some sort of cluster like school or organization. But notice what happens even in this very simple example where I just have one slope at level 1, right? My time slope at level 1. Well, this, I'm going to get another equation, right? This randomly varies at, well, assuming I allow it to randomly vary, but I've got this equation now for pi 1 sub ij is equal to beta 1 naught j plus r sub 1 ij. So what is this? Well, think about it. This is like saying, you know, okay, so again, at level 1, I've got intercept, right? That's going to vary across people, and I've got my time slope that's going to vary across people. But now I'm saying the intercept is a function of beta naught naught. So it's like the intercept is a function of the, let's say it's school. Let's say school is my level 3 here. So the intercept is a function of the school intercept, right? So each school could have its own starting place. So that's the beta naught naught j, right? And then, right, I've got random variation with, you know, I've got the random variation of people within school, right? And then here I've got this slope, right? This is my growth slope, which is randomly varying, like randomly varying across people, but now, which it always was, but also schools can have different slopes. So that's really what the beta, like, about this for a second. This is like the school slope, right? Or the intercept of the school. This is like school intercept. So we've got this overall intercept, overall growth slope, and then we've got sort of the deviation of this school J from the overall, and that's what I get here. In terms of their slope, I get the deviation of school J from the overall intercept, right? That's going to be my U here. And then just, I mean, this is all the same except for the subscripts, right? So I have, you know, people can have different slopes, right? People can have different intercepts, but now schools can have different slopes and different intercepts. And so now, again, these variances are really about between person within school. And that's when we turn them into variances, it's between person within school variances, right? Yep. And they are between person within school. What does this mean in terms of our tau matrix? Like already, this looks a lot more complicated, right? Because I've got what, five equations now instead of 3. What does it look like for my tau matrix? Okay, well, actually, I'm going to have 2 tau matrices now. I'm going to have the tau pi, which is my level 2 tau matrix. Looks just like it did, right? Because I'm allowing the intercept and the slope to randomly vary across people within schools. So this is my tau pi matrix, right? But I'm going to get the same thing at level 3 because I'm allowing the slope and the intercept to randomly vary across schools. This is my tau beta matrix. So now again, unconditional linear growth model, totally unconditional. And I have a sigma squared, right? If we think about how many parameters, we've got 3 tau pi's, right? And 3 tau betas. So we actually have 7 variance covariance components. Okay, I'll stop in just a sec. So then, again, so maybe in this case, maybe I just want to know, like, what's the proportion of variance that lies between schools in terms of the intercept? So how much of the between school variance in the, like, how much of the variance in the where schools are, how much of the variance in where kids start is explained by the intercept? By school. Sorry. How much of the variance in where kids start, the intercept, is explained by school? That's the proportion of variance that lies between schools on the intercept. So I can do that. I could just take like tau beta naught naught and divide it by tau pi naught naught plus tau beta naught naught. I'm not putting sigma squared in there anymore because I'm just saying, like, I want to know of the intercept variance, how much of the intercept variance is explained by school? See what I'm saying? How much of the intercept variance is explained by cluster? Here I'm saying, how much of the variance in the growth slope is explained by school? So for this, I could just take tau beta 1, 1. That's that between school variance in the slope. And I could divide it by tau pi 1, 1 plus tau beta 1, 1. Because these are the two, right? Because really what I'm saying now is I've got, instead of just having variance in the slope, the variance in the slope is itself, some of that variance is between people within schools, and some of that variance is between. All right. And then I'm just going to show you, I'm not even going to, okay, I'm going to go. So like, just imagine that I put this all together, right? And I put in like a level 2 covariate, let's say. And so let's go back here. So imagine a general 3-level model with one covariate at level 2 and one covariate at level 3, I think is what I did. So here we've got our level 1 model, let's say, right? We've got our level 2 model. So X is some variable. And then we've got our level 3 model, right? And what you see is like things get really big and kind of ugly really fast. And our tau matrix gets ginormous, right? Our tau, I mean, again, if we allow everything to be randomly varying, like our tau beta matrix, with just like one randomly varying level 2 predictor, it gets big because like look what's happening here. If you look at this tau, for example, oops, wait, go back here, where did I go? Come back. Here we go. So if you look here, right, in this level 3 model, oh, let me go back to the level 2 model. Level 2 model, looks simple. Level 2 model, I just put in like a person level characteristic, let's say, right, as a predictor of the intercept and as a predictor of the slope. So I've got one level 2 variable as a predictor of the intercept and the slope. Great, no problem. But then remember now all of these things can randomly vary, right? This can randomly vary. This can randomly vary across schools. This can randomly vary across schools. This can randomly vary across schools. This can randomly vary across schools, right? So now, when I get to level 3, that's where I get this. And the question is, what the heck are all those things? Well, you know, this is just going to be like the between cluster variance and the intercept. And this tau, whoops, show. I don't know. I can, maybe I need to come up here to do it. Yeah, that worked. Okay. So, like between cluster variance intercept, cluster variance the slope, and the intercept of the slope, technically the between cluster variance, residual variance, in the intercept of the growth slope. But what the heck is this? This is like the between group variance in the beta naught 1 slope, which is like the effect of the person level characteristic on the intercept. And this is the between cluster variance in the effect of, again, I'm assuming this is like a times at level 1. This is the between cluster variance in the effect of the person level characteristic on the growth slope. Oh my God, right? Did you get that? It's a lot. So we've got between cluster variance, the intercept of the intercept, variance in the intercept of the slope, between cluster variance in the effect of the level 2 variable on the intercept, between cluster variance in the effect of the level 2 variance on the slope. And then, God help you, you get a tau matrix that looks like this, right? And then the question is like, oh my God, what does this mean? I interpret like the, right? This, again, remember, this is the between cluster like this is the between cluster variance or the, you know, the random effect for the, okay, the effect of the level 1 variable on the slope, right? And then just intercept and slope. Now it's the covariance of those. This is the, like, this is like beta not one. Yeah, here, like, this is the between cluster variance in effect of the level 2 variable on the intercept. The covariance between the effect of the level 2 variable on the intercept and the effect of the level 2. How do you interpret it? I'm not going to drag you through all of that. It's a little bit of a mind teaser, but what I have done, which is helpful, is on these PowerPoint slides, I've actually written down in words what all of these things mean for the tau beta matrix. And I've done it, as you can see, like just in general. And then God help you, it really depends on how you center these things, right? Because I was saying like intercept of the intercept and intercept of the slope, and you got to think about if you're group mean centering at level 2 or grand mean, right? Now you got to make centering decisions at level 1 and level 2. So I have also for you, and again, I'm not going to go through these right now, but I've written out for you, how would you interpret like all of these effects, all of the gammas in an uncentered model, in a group mean centered, like if you group mean centered at level 2 and grand mean centered at level 3, or if you grand mean centered at level 2 and grand mean centered at level 3. And so like all of that's written out for you. So, but you know, so in some ways, like there's nothing really new about 3 levels. But in other ways, it's just like, oh, it's just more of those things that we found annoying about 2-level models, right? Like it's just like exponentiated or whatever. So it's like not hard, but you just really like if you thought you had to think things through carefully with a 2-level model, now you really got to think things through extra special carefully with a 3-level model. And God help you. I've written grants where I've had to write out 4-level models for the grant, and like God help you with the notation and the right and the nature. Oh gosh, yeah. And again, just so it's just you take it slow. Like there's no there, you know, you take it slow and you really got to think it through. But I think at least having some of the verbiages, I think at least a little bit helpful. If you find yourself doing 3-level models, some ways it's nothing new, but in other ways it's just being really careful about applying everything. Let's take a 10-minute break, come back and talk about residuals. Do I want to end the show? Yes. Here, let's go back to my office for a second, because I think I want to finish this and get another break. Dying of thirst. Oh, and I should maybe remind me to restart this, but let me, I'm sharing my screen. Okay, there we go. All right, so let me pass it out. We only have about an hour. Whoops, we only have about an hour left, so we're obviously not going to get through everything that I've got here today. But I do want to show you how to get these. I want to show you some of the empirical Bayes stuff. Quickly, and then we can. Okay, and I did unplay. Yes, recording's in progress. Okay, great. All right, so okay, so I want to show you a few things in R in terms of getting some of the residuals that actually we've been talking about. Well, we've been talking about the U's and the R's and all that kind of good stuff. So I want to show you how to get residuals and some of the randomly varying coefficients and that kind of thing. And then if there's time, we'll talk about some other residual diagnostics if we run out of time to do all of the residual we don't have time to do all of the residual diagnostics, but you'll find the PowerPoint and the second half of this R Markdown file give you lots of instructions for how to actually do residual analyses. And it's in some ways very similar to multiple regression, but yeah, we have residuals and more levels, but we use a lot of the same sort of strategies. Now, I think if you open this up, it was probably telling you that HLM diag is needed, but it wasn't installed, so you can go ahead and install that. Although the stuff that I'm about to show you for empirical Bayes residual does not require that, but I would say a word about HLM diag. HLM all caps diag is a package that's particularly nice for residual analyses in multi-level models. So and there are other ways you can do residual analyses, but here at least. It's not downloading. Diag. It's not downloading. Well, install it. So I at the top of my screen said diag is not installed. Do you want to install it? And I said yes. But if you don't get prompts like that, you need to do install.diag. Again, I don't think we're really probably going to be using it right now, so we're not an issue. Let's go ahead and NYS. So you remember our NYS data set. This is the longitudinal data set where we've got attitudes, antisocial attitudes at five points from ages 11 to 15. Done a lot with it so far. We've fit linear models, we fit piecewise models, we fit cubic models, whatever, lots of things. So right now, in the NYS data set, go ahead and run this little code that's going to tell it to create some factor variables. And then actually, this is all just to get some descriptive statistics, but I'm going to skip through the descriptive statistics stuff because I don't really, or at least that descriptive statistics stuff, because we've seen it before. Here we have wave-specific descriptive statistics. Just to remind ourselves, remember we saw that at age 11, antisocial attitudes were about 0.21, right? And then it's like 0.2. You remember these numbers from a couple weeks ago? 0.21, 0.24, 0.33, 0.41, and 0.45. Okay. And then if we wanted to look at the variances, these are you can see the variances, and these aren't the residual variances. These are like the total variances. They are actually increasing across time. They look super small, but that's really because of the metric that NYS is on. Okay. Oh yeah. So we don't have to do this right now, but I'll just mention that when I was poking around, I found a center. There's a package called MLM Tools, and they have a centering option that seems to be particularly easy. So for those of you who might be sick of writing all the code for centering, you might want to play around with that. So it's library MLM Tools, and then you can see it's like, I can just center. So, and I think there are options for group mean and grand mean centering. So you might want to play around with that. We're going to skip that for right now because we don't care about that in this moment. And we're going to just run an unconditional linear growth model because I want to show you some residuals. And again, this is not our best model. And I thought about, doing all the residuals for all the different models to compare all the residuals. But then I realized if I did all that, we would never have time to go through it all. So I'm just going to show you residuals from the linear model. But remember, this is, generally speaking, when you're, you would use your best, your final model probably is the model you're going to be most interested in, right? But for simplicity, we're going to be looking at the linear model so that we can kind of just do some stuff. Okay, so we're going to run a simple linear model. Code is right there. Just to remind ourselves what this looks like. Again, we've got the intercept is 0.2. The growth slope is about 0.065. It's linear, so we're assuming that the growth is constant across time. And we've got a randomly varying intercept and slope and a covariance between them. Okay. All right. Skip all of this. Okay. So randomly varying coefficients. Now here, I could go to visual, right? That kind of works. Let's see. Maybe. Please. Okay. Okay. Oh, no, I got to scroll down again. Oh, here we are. Randomly varying coefficients. Oh, wait, okay. Back up. There we go. Randomly varying coefficient. Okay. So remember, here I just have our level 2 model. So again, simple linear growth model. Remember our level 1 model, is one model. But then remember for level 2, we've got randomly varying intercept. Saying there's this intercept at random. The R. So got this intercept for person I, and it's a function of the overall intercept and this residual, this random effect for the intercept, right? So this is the sort of the difference between person I's intercept and the expected intercept, right? And we have the same thing for the slope. We've got, this should all be reviewed. I'm sure you're all with me. So we've got this coefficient, right? For this, we've got a slope for person I, and that's a function of the expected slope, like the model overall slope, that beta 1 naught, which is a fixed effect, plus the random, the random slope. Okay. So these random coefficients, they're not actually parameters in our model. And we've said that before. The parameters in our model are the variance, covariance components, and the fixed factors, right? So when we're counting the number of parameters, we can count all those things. But just like in regression, in regression, the residuals aren't parameters in your model, right? You get a residual variance, that you get one of them, and that's a parameter in your model. But for each person in your model, you could compute a residual, which is the difference between that person's actual score and their model predicted score, right? And we can do the same thing here. We can do that at level 1 and get the difference between the time, the actual time score, the actual score at time whatever, and the model predicted score at time whatever. And I'll show that in a minute. But even more interesting, I think, is to be looking to get the level 2 coefficients, especially on this unconditional model, because that really, what we're really saying is that each person has their own intercept and each person has their own slope. And it could be really interesting, right? To look at how do people's intercept, again, we have the variance in the intercept, so we know how much variability there is, but we can actually see what are different people's intercepts look like and what do different people's growth slopes look like, right? And theoretically, there are downsides to this too, but theoretically, I can even use those empirical Bayes coefficients as predictors in some other model, right? I could be like, well, maybe how fast, people grow, maybe that predicts, where they are in 5th grade or something in terms of reading or whatever. So I can actually create these for each person, and I can then save them. So let's just so if I use the command coef model, that's just going to give me the randomly varying coefficients for the intercepts and or slopes for each cluster. And because or in this case person, because it's longitudinal, right? So level 2 unit. So there are going to be J rows, one for each cluster or one for each person. So when I do this COEF model, I'm actually going to get the randomly varying coefficients for the intercepts and slopes for each person in the model. Okay, and again, I can get them, I can look at them, I can save them in a list, I could save them as a data frame, but let's just start by looking at them. Like, I think that's, okay, so now I want to go back to source. Okay. So let's just, let me take out include equals false here. I did that because I messed up and had a lot of these things put on. The beta is, I mean, in some sense, not technically exactly, but yeah, I mean, right? Yeah, I mean, the beta is the expected value across everybody, right? Yeah. So, but I think it's a good way of thinking in the sense that, again, if you look at the intercepts, remember that the beta, the gamma beta, the beta not was 0.2, right? Which was sort of, yeah, across everybody, the expected value for the intercept is 0.2, and across everybody, the expected value for the slope is 0.065. So like when I say, like, you know, I hedge a little bit because, like, you know, are you gonna, if you just took the average of these, get exactly the same number? No, likelihood, blah, blah, blah. But yes, conceptually, yes, that's exactly what it is. Okay. So, so that perspective, if you look at the intercepts and the slopes for the first, you can see we've got the IDs for people, as many rows as we've got people. And you can see, like, this first person, they have a, like, again, remember my overall intercept was 0.2 and my overall slope was 0.065. So what would you say about person one in terms of their antisocial attitudes? Wanted to tell me something about this person, this kid. Was 0.065. So they, so this kid starts low, right? And the kid grows slowly, right? So this is a kid who has low antisocial attitudes at the jump, and who's predicted, again, these are predicted for the kid, right? So these are also like model based for the kid, right? So we're fitting a linear trajectory to all 5 of those data points, right? But the best linear trajectory to those data points is basically pretty much flat, right? So this is a kid who starts low and grows very little from ages 11 to 15, looks like. Contrast that to, like, ID number 9. Look at ID 9. Like, this is a very different kid, right? Because remember I said that at age 11, the predicted value, or the predicted intercept, which is the predicted value at age 11, is 0.42. And now the growth slope is like 0.122. And remember, we said that the overall was like 0.065. So this is a kid who's about twice as high as the average kid in the sample, right? In terms of antisocial attitudes, and who's also growing twice as fast. So which kid would you want to be your kid? Kid 3 or kid 9? The answer is obvious, right? Not kid 9, kid 3. And then kid 8 is sort of somewhere in the middle and actually pretty similar to the overall averages, right? Like a little bit higher in terms of where he's starting out, or she, I don't know, and a little bit faster growth slope, but not too far off, right? And then, you know, like, and even just sort of eyeballing it here, you can see it kind of looks like there'd be a positive correlation between where kids start and how fast they grow, right? Because it does seem like the lower intercept kids tend to have, at least with the first, 20 some that are on this slide, it looks like the kids who start lower tend to also have lower slope. But it's not a perfect relationship by any stretch. But that's how I can get my coefficients. Pretty cool, right? Okay, so next thing should have just X'd it out. Okay, so here I'm just showing like you could save those, you know, if I wanted to, I could just save those in data frame, right? Okay, the next thing, and maybe I won't toggle back because it'll start me at the beginning. But if you look on page, where am I? Page. Yeah, okay, page, oh, I didn't put page numbers on this either, sorry. Where it says randomly varying coefficients at the bottom where it says 2 coefficients for each person. So we've got 2 coefficients for each person, the pi naught I and the pi 1I, which we just looked at. Those are the randomly varying coefficients that we saw. But remember that pi naught I and pi 1I are, if you think about our multi-level model, they are literally like beta naught plus r sub naught j is pi naught I, right? So a kid's randomly varying intercept is, said this like all semester long, it's like overall, it's the expected value for the intercept, it's that beta naught plus the residual, that r sub naught I, is actually the difference between the kid's intercept and the overall intercept, right? So we should actually then able, what? Yeah, unfortunately, I think it's like page 1, 2, 3, 4, bottom of page 4, right? So just remember that we're talking about those randomly varying coefficients that we just saw. They are a function of the fixed effect plus the level 2 residual, right? So I could also ask for the level 2 residuals, the random effects, right? So how do I do that? Okay, I'm going to skip through some of this stuff right now. Where this is just where like I created a data frame, I renamed the variables. I mean, I can I guess. But here I want to, oh, well, here I'll run this. Here I want to create the random effects for the model. So actually, I'll just run this. So here I've just said like RI1. So these are like the random effects for and the _1 is just for model 1 in case I want to do other models. So the random effects for model 1, and I the frame, and to get the random effects out, like it's just random. So if for example, I just wanted to see them, which I should have probably done. There we go. It's random effects for NYS1. There we go. All right. So here are the random effects. So these are like my R's, right? My R sub naught J, my R sub 1J. And now think back to what we were talking about with person 3. Remember we said person 3 was like way lower than the average. Remember the average was like 0.2, and we saw that person 3 was starting at like just under 0.1, I think. And then remember we said that person 3's growth slope was really low, like the average growth slope was like 0.065, and person 3's growth slope was like 0.00 something small. I don't remember exactly what it was. But now I'm looking at, these are now my residuals. These are the R sub 1, or sorry, R sub naught J and R sub 1J. And tracks exactly like you would expect, right? This person is 0.1 lower, like their coefficient, their randomly varying coefficient, their coefficient is like 0.105 lower than beta naught, and their slope is like 0.058 lower than that 0.065 slope. You see what I'm saying? And then remember we looked at person 9 and we see the same thing. Now their residual is like 0.222 higher, so like they're way higher than average in terms of their intercept, and they're also higher than average in terms of their slope. And this can be really helpful to look at too, because now I really am seeing people sort of like, well, both things are helpful, right? And I can get from one to the other really easily, which I'll show you in just a second. But like, this is really kind of showing me where people are as compared to the model, right? Whereas the other version is just showing me like, what are their slopes? What are their intercepts? So there are times where you might want to use one of these and times where you might want to use the other one. But obviously, I can go from one to the other pretty easily. How could I get the randomly varying coefficients from this? What could I do if let's say I just had this and I didn't know how to get the randomly varying coefficients, but I knew what my betas were. How could I create the randomly varying coefficients? Besides like Googling it and finding out what the R code is, but exactly. Like all I have to do is take these are my residuals. And remember what we keep saying over and over and over again is like beta naught I, right, equal, or sorry, I naught sub I naught sub I is equal to beta naught naught, right, plus R sub naught I. And pi 1 sub I is equal to beta 1 naught plus R1 sub I. So I know that this is 0.2, and I know that this is 0.065. I mean, obviously, actual number from R, right? And these are these things that I'm looking at right now. So the coefficients that I was just looking at, I can totally recreate them by just saying, take beta naught naught, whatever it is, the 0.2 something, plus these residuals will actually give me the pi sub naught I. And taking beta 1 naught plus the residuals that are in column 2, the slope residuals, will give me pi sub 1 I. So I can go, it's like really easy to go back and forth, right, between the residuals and these randomly varying coefficients. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, I think these are they're really useful and they can be really, really interesting. Like you could imagine a situation where, like, let's say I ran this model and I want to know who are the kids who are like the most at risk for, like the sort of the most problematic kids in terms of antisocial attitudes, right? That maybe they're now 15 years old. Maybe I want to intervene and I'm going to pick some kids for a group or something, right? And I could actually look at technically I could look at the residuals or the coefficients, right? Because the residuals are going to tell me who's above or below the mean, or the coefficients, and I could pick out like who are the highest kids, who are the lowest kids, right? And these are not OLS residuals, by the way. They're empirical Bayes residuals. So that actually means that they are, what that means? It means a lot of things, but it means that they're shrunken toward the model-based estimates, and how much they're shrunken toward the model-based estimate is a function of the reliability, right? You remember way back when we talked about reliability. We talked about it, I think, when we were talking about cross-sectional models. And I said that the reliability is like tau naught naught divided by tau naught naught plus sigma squared J. And again, we were really talking about this in an organizational model. So we said like different clusters have different sample sizes. And because different clusters have different sample sizes, have different reliabilities. What's this reliability? The reliability is the reliability with which the sample mean can estimate like the true school mean. Or in this case, we can actually get liabilities for both the intercept and the growth slope. And those reliability estimates would tell me like the reliability with which sort of you can kind of think of this as like OLS, the reliability with which like the intercept, like just the sort of OLS intercept or the is a good estimate of sort of the true intercept, and the reliability with which the sort of OLS slope is a good estimate of the true slope. And different in organizational models, different, again, we're not talking about growth slopes, but we see that like the more people you have in a sample, the higher the reliability is going to be. Like the between cluster variance is the same across models or across clusters, but this N sub j differs across clusters. So if you have, remember we talked about this way back when, but like if you had 2,000 people in a school, you would feel like the school mean is a much more reliable estimate of the true school mean than if you had like 3 people in the school. Now, here with the longitudinal models, we basically have the same, we have basically like, I think for almost everybody, we've got 5 time points, right? So in a longitudinal case, if everybody's got the same number of time points, all of these are going to end up having basically the same reliabilities. Like the reliability is not really going to be different across the clusters because I collected 5 time points per cluster. It's also, though, if you think about it, the reliability is going to be lower for a longitudinal model, for these parameters for longitudinal models than they are for cross-sectional models generally, because, N sub j here is like 5, whereas in some of our other examples, we like, an average of 4. So the reliability with which we estimate something, is the reliability with which sort of the OLS estimates are good estimates of the true parameters is going to be lower if we have fewer time points or fewer observations per cluster, which in this case with time points, we generally do. Now, so what that means is that if you were to, for each person, you could take each person's score and you could fit like an intercept and a slope for that person. That would be the OLS slope and intercept. But that wouldn't actually give you these numbers because these numbers are taking into account the reliability, saying, actually, I don't have total confidence in the OLS estimates, so I'm going to sort of shrink those OLS estimates toward the model-based estimates. So that tends to be a good thing. Actually, might sound like a bad thing, but again, like how much faith do you want to put in on how much faith do you want to put, like if you get, and what the people who end up getting more shrunken often tend to be those, obviously with more extreme values and also with fewer, like how much faith would you want to put in? There are very few plays outlandishly high or whatever, but so anyway, I'll stop talking about reliability. But it is an important idea. We tend to use more in the cross-sectional, but we could use in longitudinal case too. Okay. Oh, wait, let me be smart this time. Just X this out. Okay, so that's how I get my random effects. Here I have a frame for the random effects. And I show how you could actually compute. I'll skip through that because we don't have a lot of time, but I showed how you can actually get those random effects and how I could like merge them with our NYS data. Okay, so I could also though get predicted scores for people using either like fitted or predict. So let's run this. Going. Oh, I forgot to, oh, it's over here. Fitted. Let's look over here. There we go. So this, I can also get fitted values or predicted values using fitted or predict to get, but okay. no, I'm not going to belabor that. All right. Oh, okay. Well, I did do predicted. I could actually create predicted scores for piecewise and polynomial models for everybody. Do I want to do that? No, I don't think so. I think I want to skip that. Okay, we talked about random effects, putting in one data frame. Okay, so you could get predicted values. You know how to get predicted values in other ways as well. Well, actually, no, maybe I will show. Well, actually, I will show that, I guess. Let me go back here. Okay. Okay, let's run these. I will show you how to do this. Pieces so we can do the piecewise model. So this is going to be NYS2. And we should be able to, again, this is our two-piece piecewise model that we did before. We can create a data frame with the coefficients from model 2. Remember how I talked about like the randomly varying slopes and intercepts? Okay, so now go to PI_2 over here. Whoops. And notice that in this data frame now, because this is the piecewise model, I now actually have 3 coefficients, right? I have the intercept, I have the piece 1 growth slope, and I have the piece 2 growth slope. I have those for every, and again, I'm allowing those to randomly vary across people. So I've got different piecewise growth slopes for everybody in the model. So let's just take a look at numbers 3 and 9 again, because those are the ones we were looking at before. So you can see that the intercept's pretty similar here. Again, these are like our coefficients, right? So I've got 0.09. That's very similar to what we have with the linear model. Interesting though, this is like really interesting with the piecewise model. Now, what I'm seeing is, remember person 3, their linear growth was almost 0. This is saying like from 11 to 12 and from 12 to 14, this person grows at a rate of about 0.03 points per year, which is actually, or 0.029, whatever, that's actually spot on. If you probably don't remember all these coefficients as well as I do, I've done it. But that is like exactly what the coefficient was in our piecewise model. So this person is actually average in terms of their growth rate from 11 to 12 and 12 to 14. 11 to 12 and 14 to 15. But why we got that linear slope that was near 0 is because look at piece 2. Piece 2, they're actually between 12 and 14, this person is actually declining. So if you think about, again, you remember that on average, our slope looked like this. Something, okay, not very well drawn, but something like that, right? We had, this is like 11 to 12, 14 to 15, and it was flatter here, and it was steeper here. But think about what this is saying about this person. This person's slope is actually, well, it's about the same from 11 to 12 as the other one. But now from 12 to 14, they're actually climbing a little bit. And then from 14 to 15, they're going back up a little bit, right? So on average, remember, we had something that looks like this, but this person, this is actually their predicted trajectory. And it's really different. And this goes back to what I was talking about when we talked about piecewise models and how, because we're allowing these coefficients to randomly vary, even though this might be what like the model average looks like across all people, there might actually be no person who looks like this, right? This is just like the average across, again, conceptually, the average across everybody, the expected value across everybody, but this person looks like really different. Like their pattern is really different from that. Let's look at number 9, because we looked at number 9 before, right? Okay, and this person is kind of interesting too. So they're at they're 0.48, so their intercept looks very similar to what it looked like in the linear model. That's not very surprising, right? And then for piece 1, no, piece one is fixed across everybody. Now that I look at the second person, I realize we're not estimating a random effect for piece one. See? Everybody's 0.028. So we're assuming everybody, right? Because remember how we did that? So everybody's got a 0.028 here. Everybody we're assuming that's the yeah. So maybe this person wouldn't have had a 0.028 had we allowed this piece to random. But okay, so again, so why is this person a 0.028? Well, because again, we're not allowing that to randomly 287. But the piece two slope is very, very steep. Now, I could again, like I could rerun this and allow this piece one to randomly vary, and then I could really see, like, that would be probably more interesting to see how this piece is kind of. All right, does this all make sense? Yeah? Okay. And do you see how, like, this is really actually very, like, very interesting, right? It's a very interesting kind of deep dive into some of your data. Let me close this data frame so I don't have to close it. Okay, here we go. So back here. Anything else I want to say? Okay, so so for predicted values, let's see here. I don't think I didn't run all this stuff yet, so I'm going to kind of skip through that. But again, I can create the predicted values. I could create the predicted values myself. So I'm just going to show this. And this is now not the predicted values for like each. So we were getting when we were getting predicted values before, we were getting predicted values like kind of like across for prototypical people. But here I can get predicted values for like each person, right? Because I can actually take like the like each person has a different piece pi sub naught I, right? And then each person has, because that's what this is. This is the randomly varying. So I could take each person's randomly varying intercept plus each person's randomly varying slope times piece 1c, which remember is the time variable that's coded the way I need it to be so that it turns off and on at the right times, plus the piece 2 coefficient times the piece 2 time variable. And if I do this, and if I run everything above, which I don't think I have, but if I run everything above and I do this, then I can actually get predicted scale. I'll do it. Then I can actually get predicted scores for each person at each time, which is actually kind of cool. Back here. Okay, so run. I think this is the way to run. Object NYS resids not found. Uh-oh. Did I not create that? Above. There we go. Now, see, this is what happens when you skip things. There we go. NYS. Here it is. Okay. That wasn't the first time I called it. There it is. There we go. Okay. So I'm creating this residual data file. It's going to everything here. So I can get down here and show you what I think is kind of cool. So here, okay, so I've got my residuals. Yes, residuals. Here we go. Here's my NYS resid file right now. So the file that I created actually has each person's ID variable, the number of time points, and I have their pi, so I have their randomly varying coefficients. So right now, these are the clear ones. And then here, I've actually got their residuals, their random effects, right? Then, oh, back up here, pi naught, pi 1, and the pi 1, 1, because let me show you that. Okay, so here in NYS residuals, I'm literally creating their randomly varying coefficients by taking beta, like we were talking about earlier. I take the beta plus the random effect and the beta plus the random effect. So I create two new variables. I use capital P's there just to switch from the random effects that have the small p's. But if you go back to the data file, what you'll see is back to the data file. Here it is. Notice that these are identical. Do you see that? I basically just took beta plus this, not this. Now, but remember that it was about 0.2. So I took that plus this. I took the 0.05 times this, gives me this. And see that these are totally identical to these. So what I was trying to show here is that these randomly varying coefficients I can recreate by just taking the random effects plus my fixed effects. Give me my random coefficient as well they should. Okay. So going back here. Okay. So if I wanted to get predicted values now, what I did now with this NYS combined, yeah, this is where things get a little cumbersome, and you just have to, but with NYS combined, I actually took my NYS like data file, so you can like my original NYS data file, and I combined in there my randomly varying coefficients, these pi's, and notice that the pi's are the same in 5 rows. Why? Yeah, it's one person, right? And this one person has one randomly varying intercept. So to get the predicted value, though, like I'm going to need to use it across all 5 time points. But this is one randomly varying intercept. This is one randomly varying linear growth slope. But it's repeated 5 times because I've got 5 data points for that person. All right, so going back to this. Okay, so that is my combined data file. So if I come over here to my combined data file, that's what I can values at each time point for each person. I call that predict linear. Just remember, it's the linear model that I'm creating predicted values for. And that's going to be this pi, not I. That's the person's randomly varying intercept, plus pi 1i. That's their growth slope. They're randomly varying, like for their growth slope. It does randomly vary, but like the empirical, it's really the empirical Bayes estimate for their growth slope times age 11. Age 11, remember, is a time variable in my data file that's coded 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And so by doing this, I'm going to actually get the predicted linear values, not just like overall, but actually for each person. So let's run this. Okay, and now I want to look at NYS combined. Whoops. And here you go. So you can see that like now I actually have this, again, using their own coefficients, right? I actually have this person's predicted score. It like goes from 0.092 to 0.099 to 1.06 to 0.2 to 0.1196. And let's look at person 9. 9's here, 0.42, 0.54, 0.6, 0.7. 2 people I was looking at. Yeah, this is just a linear model. I could do the same thing with the size model. Then an interesting question is, okay, like how well do these predicted values actually, how well do they align with the person's actual values? I had you do that just like in aggregate, you know, for predicted values in other homeworks. But I think another question is like, you know, person by person, how well do these predicted values actually align with the person's actual scores, right? So, and to do that, I could, like, we're just going to eyeball it right now, but I could compare, like, here are these predicted linear scores, right? And what are the person's actual scores? Here are the person's actual scores, which, by the way, are super wonky if you look at them. It's 0.11, 0.2, 0.11. Which kind of explains why we were getting a weird pattern when we allowed for the piecewise model, where they were going up and then down and then up, because you kind of actually see that, right? So again, like I could look at I could do all kinds of things. Now I've got both of these things in the same data file, so I could map this, I could summarize this, I could, probe which, I could probe various people or whatever. Does that all make sense? Yeah. Okay. And I think I've got the same thing here. Let's see. So I'm saying you could also get, again, you could also get these scores more easily if you don't want to go to all that trouble. In this case, you could actually get those scores by just using either fitted or predict. So fitted, let's see, let me show you. Again, these are the same, if you look at them, these fitted scores are the same as the ones that I actually computed the longhand way. So would you actually want to do it the way I just did it? Probably not. You probably want to use fitted or predict. But again, I think it's good to understand where all this is coming from. And now, here's predict. See that it looks pretty much the same. Where'd predict go? Predict. There it is. Predict. There it is. See, looks the same. And now finally, let us do a little plot. Oh, I have include equals false, so you can't see the plot. Hold on. Oh yeah, I don't think this is that great a plot. Because it's across everybody. So this is, I mean, it's fine, but it's maybe less interesting than other plots you could do. So this is a scatter plot that looks at like the linear predicted value versus the actual score, but it's both across time and across people. So I would say this is not your most useful graphic, but there it is. Okay. Okay, so I could do this for the piecewise and polynomial models too, but I think I'm not going to do that because I would like to just talk a tiny little bit about the HSB, the cross-sectional data file. But is there any questions about sort of the longitudinal randomly varying coefficients, residuals, getting predicted values for individual people? Again, don't have a homework doing this, so, but it's very useful stuff to be able to do. Everybody see why it would be useful. Yeah, good. You're also quiet. Residuals have, like, I don't know, lulled you into a state of, I know, residuals are not like the world's most interesting. I'll grant you that. But again, it is. Okay, so let's move on to the HSB data. There were a couple things that I wanted to show you in this. It had to do with residuals and reliability and that kind of stuff. So let's read in the HSB data file. As a data frame. Okay, we create some factor variables. Okay, I'm going to do like a really simple model here. I think an unconditional random effects ANOVA model. So we've got like a completely unconditional model. So here it is. There's not much more that's interesting in our unconditional model besides the variance components. I mean, we are getting also a gamma not. But okay, we already know about getting these randomly varying coefficients, right? But let's just take a look at this. We got 160 schools, and oh, I forget, was gamma not? Like, and now I wish I knew because it would make it a lot more interesting to compare. Hold on. Stick it in. Where was I? Okay, here we are. This is what model 0. Okay, right. 12 point, where'd it go? Hold on. Scroll down. Fixed effects, 12.64. Yeah. So 12.64. So now that's kind of helpful to remember when we go to okay, let's go back here, right? I didn't have to rerun that because I'd already run it. Okay. So remember, we've got nothing. We're just basically, this is just like school. These are basically like the school means, but they're the empirical based estimates of the school means. They're not literally the means for each school. They're the empirical based estimates of the school mean, which again, remember I was talking about reliability. I think this is where it's easier to think about reliability over here in this nice unconditional model. So remember the reliability with which I can estimate the true school mean from the sample-based mean is a function of tau naught naught divided by tau naught naught plus sigma squared divided by n sub j. So now this is a more interesting example for reliability because in the longitudinal example, everybody had 5 data points. So everybody had the same reliability. So however much shrinkage there was, it was going to be the same across every person. But here we have really different sample sizes at level 2. So, you know, we can compute the reliability pretty easily. We know what tau naught naught, well, what was tau naught naught, by the way? Had that. 30 something go. Did it go? We had it. Oh, there we go. Here we go. So tau naught naught is 39.15. Sigma squared is, what is it, 8 point something? Okay, so the reliability, it's going to be 0.61 divided by 8.61 plus 39.15 divided by n sub j. Like, if I had infinite people in a cluster, what would my reliability be? 8.61 divided by 8.61. And even if I have like several thousand people in the cluster, this number gets so small that my reliability is basically going to be virtually 1, right? So basically what that's saying is like, oh, I can estimate the true school mean using my sample mean really reliably. Like my sample mean is a really reliable estimate of the true school mean if I've got thousands of people. But what about if I have only like, 2 people per cluster or 4 people per cluster? Well, if I divide this by 39.15 divided by 4, let's say, right, is going to be just under 10. Get 8.61 divided by like basically 18.5, something around that, right? Is that right? No. Right. So my reliability is going to be less than 0.5 in that case, right? So that would be saying like with only 4 people, the school mean is not a good estimate of the true school mean. Everybody with me on that? Okay. So 9 minutes left. Okay, so I can save these if I know I feel like I've already done that a million times. I could save my random effect too. Here, what I'm doing is I'm actually creating a data set of school means. Because remember, I was just saying, like, how good is this, how reliable an estimate of the true mean is the school mean. So I am just creating a data set of school means. And now I'm going to include the random effects in that data file. And I can include the randomly varying intercepts in that data file as well. Okay, and okay, and this is my gamma naught naught, right? And remember, if I take gamma naught naught plus my random effect, I should get my empirical Bayes coefficient, right? So I can show that that's the case. So I'm going to actually put those in the HC. So all I'm saying here is like the random effect, beta not J. So that's going to be the the randomly varying coefficient. This is the coefficient, beta not J, is going to be a function of gamma naught naught, the fixed effect, plus u sub naught J, the random effect. So this is that formula, right? And now I can look at that. Okay, and what have I got? People, SES and math, standard deviation. But here I've got like the not J. That is remember that's the random effect for school J. And this was the random coefficient for school J. And this is the thing that I created. I created my own random coefficient for school J. And I just did it by taking the fixed effect, the gamma naught naught, plus u sub naught J. And look, should, all very confirmed, gives me exactly what I think I should have. So I can basically create that variable, right? Or I can create that variable. Now, last thing I promise, and then I'll stop. How do these empirical Bayes residuals, how do they compare to the OLS residuals? Remember, so OLS residuals are just, I could take like, I could OLS residual is just going to be actual. Remember, this is the HSB mean. It's like the mean math scores across schools. So we're working at level 2. The OLS residual for school J is just going to be the math score, the math mean for school J. So math here is literally the mean for school J on math minus gamma naught naught. And if I just do that, that's actually going to give me what is equivalent to like just a regular old residual, not a multi-level modeling kind of thing, just the OLS residual. So it's multi-level modeling in the sense, not from the multi-level model, but it's really still not really. Okay, so let's run that. And I don't really care about this. This is just but I'll just run it, but I don't really need it. Okay, so now let's open this up for a second. Okay, so now here's my OLS residual, my empirical Bayes residual. What do you notice about them? Sort of scanning. Not the same, right? About the OLS residual as compared to the Bayes residual. Bayes residual, not J, and OLS sub not J. Yeah, well, I don't bigger. I know what you're saying. Bigger in absolute value is a totally fair thing to say.
Yeah.
It's always like further, right? So it's always bigger in absolute value. So when it's negative, it's a bigger negative. When it's positive, it's a bigger positive, right? So it's more extreme. I think it's probably technically a better way to say it, but I knew what you were getting at, and you're right. It's always more extreme. Why is that? Well, remember how I talked about the empirical Bayes estimates are shrunken toward the model-based estimates? How much are they shrunken toward the model-based estimates? the function of the reliability. So you can take the reliability, school J, this is the reliability, times the OLS residual, and that will actually give you the empirical Bayes residual. So it is true that they're always more extreme, but the amount of shrinkage, it's hard to see that now, but the amount of shrinkage is also a function of this sample size. So for example, like, well, let's just look here. Here there are only 20 people per cluster, and you can see the OLS residual is 3.62, and the empirical Bayes is 2.95. Whereas if we look at a lot of people. Yeah, okay. Here we've got 60 people per cluster, and the OLS is 2.77, and the OLS is 2.57. So see how the shrinkage is actually less when we have more people. Well, I can actually, and I promise this is the last thing I'm going to do. Oh yeah, at least last thing I'm going to do. Okay, so I can actually compute the reliability for each cluster. So I can just use that formula up there, compute the reliability for each cluster. Dump. And there they are. That's kind of okay. So you see them down here. You can see different clusters have different reliabilities. And I'm now going to attach that to my data file. And I'm going to create a variable now. So I've attached the reliabilities to my data file. I'm going to create a variable I'm going to call shrink. Okay. And shrink is just OLS residual. Where'd it go? OLS residual times the reliability. The reliability was done based on that. Okay. And I'm going to create that new variable. It's like our grand finale. Okay. And now, look back up here to HFE mean. Okay, so remember, shrink was, here's the reliability. I was talking about the reliability, here, right, is 0.91 for the piece. Reliability is 0.81 for the 20-person, right? And the reliability times the OLS, this times this, is the shrinkage. Trust me on that. But what's really interesting is look at my shrink. Let's see, what's my shrink match with? Tell me and you can leave. Yeah, like look, all I did is I took my OLS, well, I multiplied it by the reliability for that school, and I got the shrunken, which is empirical Bayes estimate of that residual. So you can see absolutely down the line. So now you can really, I hope this kind of then helps you to make sense of how the empirical Bayes estimates are related to the OLS estimates. And of course, you can sort of graph these against each other, and you can sort of see where there's more kind of thing. I'm going to leave it there for today. Have a really happy Thanksgiving, everybody. When we come back next week, 2 weeks, back next week. We come back in 2 weeks. The entire week on power and samples. Show you how to run power analyses with a really nice software package that's quite convenient. Yeah, lots of ways you can do power analyses, but this is an easy one. All right. Have a great Thanksgiving day. Recording.